All right. So I wanted to welcome everybody. My name is Agnieszka Paczynska, and I am the chair of Sarah's dissertation committee, and I wanted to welcome everybody here for coming. And before passing the floor to Sarah, I just wanted to make sure everybody knows who we are. So I'm the chair. This is Leslie Dwyer, who is also on the committee, and John Dale from Sociology Department, who is the outside committee member. And Sarah will present today her findings from her dissertation, From Frogs in the Lake to Learning to Stand Up, Land Rights, Social Mobilization in Cambodia. Sarah has been working on this for a number of years. She also conducted extensive field work in Cambodia. She got a Fulbright award to do the field work, so that was really terrific and really allowed her to gather really rich data. So the way we'll proceed is Sarah will present for
30-ish minutes.
30-ish minutes. We're in that general ballpark neighborhood. And then the committee will have a chance to ask questions. And then we'll open the floor for questions from those who are here. And then the committee will deliberate.
Yikes.
All right, so Sarah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank all three of you. Thank all of you for being here. I'm excited, as Agnieszka said, it's been a long process, and I'm really excited to be finally presenting the final thing. So, I'm also struggling with allergies today in addition to nerves, so if I stop or start coughing or any of those things, that's why. My research looks at resistance to forced eviction and forced dispossession in two communities in Cambodia, asking how this mobilization was being generated, sustained, and successful or partially successful in the Cambodian context, which historically there has been a lack of social mobilization and civil society activity. And currently the country is undergoing a fairly intensive period of repression of civil society, social movements, and a lot of these associated freedoms. What I found was that through engagement in this conflict and through engagement with this network of civil society actors that I'm going to be talking about, community members are building some new understandings of concepts like development and the state. And for some community members, they're building a new political consciousness and a new sense of political agency. And that new sense of political agency is one of the things allowing this mobilization to be continuing, even given the context of repression. And finally, I found that civil society plays an important role, that this network of international, regional, and local civil society is playing important roles in supporting this mobilization. So, the structure today, I'm going to talk briefly about the theory and literatures that I'm drawing on, followed by the methodology. Then I'm going to introduce the two communities, Areng Valley and Boeung Lake, and why they resist this development and these evictions. That's going to be followed by the new understandings of concepts like development in the state, new political consciousness, new political agency, and finally, the role and interventions of civil society. And I'm going to conclude with some implications of the research, of the findings. So, on the literature. To begin with, I'm going to be talking a lot about development. And development is a complex term, a complex concept, and I'm using development in two different senses. In the first sense, I'm talking about the development as a process of formation. So states develop, capitalism developed, market economies develop. In the second sense, I'm talking about development as the project of international development, what's been called development for improvement, development as improvement. So the project of developing the post-colonial states, initially economically, and recently more in terms of democracy and things like that. These two conceptions of development are quite dissimilar in some ways, but there are some connections and there are some commonalities. And one is that when we look at the critical literature, and when I'm talking about this, the critical literature on development as formation, that's the Marxist literature, and the critical literature on the process of international development, that's critical development literature and some of the post-colonial literature. If we look at that literature, we see that for the poor and marginal, processes of development often have negative outcomes, particularly including dispossession, forced eviction, that when development happens, the poorest and most marginalized are often passed over or even negatively impacted by these processes of development, and that dispossession is one of those common negative impacts. And again, if we're looking at the critical literature would tell us that dispossession is actually inherent in processes of development, and that dispossession is sometimes actually a goal of processes of development. Excuse me. And I'm touching here also on the literature on land grabbing, because the literature on land grabbing obviously relates to the literature on development, because development and land grabbing are connected in many ways. However, even in the literature on land grabbing, there's some discussion within the people writing about land grabbing about to what extent land grabbing actually exists, what constitutes a land grab, and how much of what gets called land grabbing actually is land grabbing. So in the two cases that I'm looking at, one of these cases, Boeung, that's a pretty clear case of a land grab. The other case, Areng, which I'm going to be talking about in a little while, is more actually a case of a land grab that didn't happen. However, those community members are still at risk of dispossession because of other processes of development which are taking place. So that's why, at least for this portion, I'm really focusing on the development literature. So that's kind of the rural case. When rural poor people are dispossessed or evicted, some of them become urban poor people. As urban poor people, they are often informal residents, active in the informal economy, and their being poor, informal, and marginal also puts them at risk for dispossession in urban cases. And so that's why I'm looking at two cases, a hydroelectric dam and a case of urban eviction. The literature on social mobilization, social movements, contentious collective action tells us that when people are disadvantaged or dispossessed by processes of development in either sense, they can or may be expected to resist. But all the literatures are also clear that grievance, just having a grievance, is seldom enough to motivate sustained contentious collective action. And so there are a lot of different answers about then what is it. So in a lot of the social movement literature, the focus is on opportunity structures and closing and opening opportunity structures. My answer is, in the cases that I'm looking at, this new political agency that community members are developing seems to be contributing to how they're staying engaged in these mobilizations, despite the costs and despite the negative impacts. And also that civil society, this network of civil society, is playing a role in supporting this mobilization. So, moving on to the literature. The methodology. That was the literature. My methodology in understanding this was it was informed by ethnographic, feminist, and participatory methods. The primary methodology consisted of in-depth interviews with civil society actors and community members. I interviewed staff of more than 40 organizations in Cambodia, and the interviews with civil society actors were semi-structured and focused on the roles and interventions of the organizations, the interactions between the organizations and the larger network, and the impacts these were having on the community and on the mobilization. I used then the interviews with civil society member actors to start building a pool of research participants in the two communities. Excuse me. And within the two, sorry, I just touched my microphone. Within the two communities, the interviews with community members were unstructured. I asked them really just to tell me their story of the conflict or their story of the development. I would often start an interview with just one question, which was, tell me when you first heard about the development or the evictions and what happened. And that would stretch into a sometimes lengthy interview. I also conducted participant observation at meetings, trainings, demonstrations, and just in daily life. And this is getting into the ethnographic aspects. Agnieszka mentioned I was fortunate enough to get a Fulbright. The Fulbright allowed me to really have long-term, in-depth engagement with these two communities. I was able to interview many community members multiple times and to combine interviews with observations and just joining in daily life. And that builds rapport and trust, which improves my data. It also builds the thickness and the richness of the description. And I found, I'm going to talk a little bit more about, actually I'm just going to move, sorry, I'm going to talk about that in a second. I'm going to come back to ethnographic in a moment. I also conducted document review of English language media, social media, NGO documents, and legal documents. And I'm incredibly grateful to two anonymous Cambodian academics and a lawyer working on the Areng case who gave me really remarkable access to some of the legal documents related to these cases, as well as translations of the various laws into English. Coming back to the ethical imperative behind the methodology. Again, I mentioned the ethnographic aspects came in part with the sustained interaction with these two communities and with community members and members of this network. The feminist aspect is that feminist research ethics tells us we have to pay attention to power. We have to pay attention to relations of power with our research participants and our relations of power as researchers as well. Feminist and ethnographic research also, has an imperative to focus on the voices of the marginalized. The social mobilizations in both these communities are largely female, and because of that, I focused on female research participants. I also tried to focus on participants who were marginalized in other ways, so young people, elderly, ethnic minorities, and to be aware of power and power relationships. And that meant stuff, sometimes very simple stuff, about working with a female translator and trying to interview women separately from men, so that women, for example, wouldn't feel that they had to say the exact same thing as their husband was saying. Getting into the participatory aspects of the methodology, from the beginning, from selecting forced eviction and selecting these two communities, all through the analysis and write-up, and even actually preparing for this presentation, I've invited some of my friends and my research participants, who are also my friends and colleagues, to comment on, give input on, give feedback on this information, and to pull this back together to the concept of power. We can never balance power, obviously. As a researcher, I have power in ways that my research participants don't. But I got the sense throughout the research that I was doing a good job balancing this, because some of my research participants, my key informants, eventually began pushing back against me or redirecting me if they thought I wasn't asking the right questions or focusing on the right aspects. And so that indicates to me that at least for some of my research participants, they felt that they had some power over the research as well, because that's what I was really trying to construct. So, continuing on into the cases. This is Cambodia. Sorry, it's a bit hard to see because of how bright the room is. this is Cambodia. This red star in the center is Phnom Penh. That's where Bangkok is. Over here, this red other thing is Areng Valley. Areng, and I'm going to start with Areng, and then I'm going to talk about Bangkok. Areng is in Cambodia's southwest, and it is in the central Cardamom. It's in the Cardamom Mountain Range, and this green area is Parks and Forest Reserve. It's not as large and intact as it looks. People are actually living all throughout this area, including in Areng, but the whole Cardamom region is Cambodia's largest remaining tropical forest, and actually some of the largest remaining tropical forest anywhere in Southeast Asia. So the Areng region is incredibly biodiverse and incredibly fragile as a result. There are at least 31 protected species living in the region, including a couple of critically endangered species. But the community is also home to 1,500 people in 8 villages. The majority of them, about at least 90%, are Zhang indigenous minority. And they're engaged in subsistence rice farming, but also a variety of other activities, collecting non-timber forest products. And increasingly, some community members are working mostly wage labor, mostly migrating seasonally outside of the community. Excuse me. In 2007, the Cambodian government signed an MOU with a Chinese corporation to study the feasibility of a dam on the Areng River. This dam is one of 300 dams which have been proposed, Chinese dams which have been proposed or studied within Cambodia and Laos. And the contracts are what's called BOOT, Build, Own, Operate, Transfer, which means that for a period of years, usually about 10 years, the dam and the profits actually belong to the Chinese state-owned corporation which constructed it. Further, these dam contracts come with mining and logging concessions. And so because Cambodia has large problems with corruption, there are issues of profit and corruption around these contracts. Starting around 2012, 2013, when some feasibility studies for the dam began, community members with this network of civil society began resisting the dam. They used a variety of different techniques and tactics and strategies, from institutional to non-institutional. On the institutional side, they submitted petitions, they joined court cases, and I want to talk about two of the less institutional forms of protest they used. One was a tree blessing ceremony in which they symbolically ordained trees as Buddhist monks to prevent them from being logged. And this ceremony was very well received. It was well received in the Cambodian media. It got some regional, international attention, and it was well received by the community members themselves. The idea for this tactic came from some environmental activists who'd worked in Thailand and worked with Thai environmental activists who had used this technique. And the technique actually before that might have come from an Indian tree blessing ceremony, again designed to prevent illegal logging. And I'm going to come back to that when I talk about Bangkok in a moment. And the Areng mobilization was successful. In back up. The other tactic that I wanted to talk about is for about 6 months, community members blocked the road to prevent construction and to prevent company staff members from coming into the area. And this is a photograph from the roadblock. And the roadblock became a really important space for community organizing and networking and diffusion of ideas. And so these posters, you can't read them, but these are actually various fundamental human rights. And it's actually from a handout that I believe the UN produced on human rights, using pictures to talk about human rights. And the roadblock became a space where community members interacted with people from outside of the community, and where really the solidarity was being built and this mobilization was being sustained because of the roadblock. Now, in 2017, it was announced that there was no current plan for a dam on the Areng River. This makes this community the first successful case of resistance to a dam that I'm aware of in Cambodia, or that anyone else that I've spoken with is aware of in Cambodia. And so it offers a model potentially of how other communities can successfully resist dam projects. Excuse me. Bangkok is in northern Phnom Penh. It is formerly kind of on the city outskirts, but Phnom Penh has expanded rapidly within recent years, and land has become far more valuable. Bangkok was, and to some extent still is, an urban, poor and mixed income community with an active informal economy. Many residents were initially at least informal residents. Many of them work in the informal economy. Many, many more community members just engage in the informal economy on a daily basis. Prior to the evictions, Bangkok was known for budget tourism and unfortunately for drug trade and sex work, which came along with budget tourism. And the community's been characterized as a slum. I resist that characterization and would put it more mixed income, but it was characterized as a slum as a reason to redevelop it. In 2007, the entire 133-hectare neighborhood, including 90 hectares of the lake itself, was leased to a private corporation, Shukaku Inc. Shukaku is owned by Cambodian Senator Lau Min Kin, who with his wife owns companies that control 7% of Cambodia's total landmass in leases and concessions. So there are some issues with profit and corruption around the Bangkok lease as well. In 2008, they began filling the lake. This is what the former lake looked like in 2016. Since then, they've started construction of a condo complex on it. And the majority of many community members were evicted starting at that point in 2008. But community members resisted the eviction, again with the support of the civil society network. And again, they used a variety of institutional and non-institutional tactics. And I want to talk about one of those tactics. In 2016, as a result of the World Bank continuing to fund Cambodia despite problems with land and land registration, community members egged the World Bank. They threw eggs at the World Bank. The idea from this tactic came from a Cambodian NGO staff member who learned about it from Western NGO staff members and Western social media. And in contrast to the tree blessing, the idea of which came from Thailand, the egging did not go over well. It was not received well in the media. And the community members themselves that took part told me that they either didn't understand it, they didn't get why they were throwing eggs, or they were concerned that people would blame them and think badly about them for wasting food. And so that's just one example, but a fairly interesting and dramatic example of how some of these tactics and ideas and concepts which are diffusing from other parts of the South are gaining traction in the way that concepts and ideas diffusing from the North aren't. Finally, resistance in Bangkok was partially successful. 3,000 households were evicted, but roughly 1,000 households fought the eviction, and more than 600 subsequently gained land title. This wasn't exactly a first of its kind. There was one other case that was concurrent that had a similar outcome, but it actually hasn't been completely resolved. And so Bangkok represents one of the first successful resistances to a semi-successful resistance to a large-scale eviction in Cambodia. It's also set a precedent. There hasn't been another large-scale contested eviction like Bangkok since. There have been evictions, but they've been uncontested and with higher compensation rates. So, briefly, why they resist. The reasons that community members resist forced eviction are largely reasons to do with economics and livelihood, but it's more complex than simply land and house and cash. As I mentioned, in both communities, in Areng, community members do engage in what Livian calls pluri-activity. They farm, but they farm multiple crops. They also collect forest products, and they work part-time as well around their farming schedule, some of them. In Bangkok, community members are working in the informal economy. Many community members run small businesses or work from their homes, especially female community members. One of my key informants actually ran an unlicensed pharmacy from her front room. And they also, community members rely on the network in the community. Again, especially women rely on this close network in the community of friends and family to allow them to balance their work life and their family life. So community members resist eviction for these reasons, and the compensation packages generally offered when these offered in the Bangkok case and generally offered in cases of eviction in Cambodia don't take into account these aspects. They only take into account land, house, and cash. And usually the compensation rate is far too low regardless, and that's why community members resist. As community members engage in this conflict and engage with this network of civil society, they're developing new understandings and new critiques of concepts like development in the state. And the community members' understanding of development is not quite in line always with the international development community's understanding of development, and it's definitely at odds with how development is being practiced in Cambodia today. And so one of the things that community members use, both in conversations and as a slogan in protest, is development for who? So that's why I was highlighting the corruption with both these cases, because communities are asking who's benefiting from development, because they're seeing that it's not their communities that's benefiting, but it's wealthy people benefiting and getting rich from the development. At the same time, community members are also finding that their relationship to the state is changing. Previously, community members were involved in a patronage relationship with a local patron who was also a member of the community and the networks. As the conflicts have happened and as Cambodia has developed, that has shifted, and community members are now in a relationship with the state that is more bureaucratic, less transparent, and harder for them to navigate. And they understand that to be as a result of, and maybe even punishment of, their having engaged in the mobilization. For some community members, they're building this new political consciousness. And when I say new political consciousness, I mean a political consciousness which is new for them. I don't mean the new type of political consciousness. And I want to illustrate this using an example from, I had a conversation, a group interview with a group of youth activists from Areng. And I brought up the concept of structural violence. And we struggled actually to find a translation for structural violence. And I knew we had it right when one of the young women, Chenda, slammed her hand down on the table and said, "Yes, structural violence." And she went into these two extended examples, one of home birth in the community and one of the fact that community members, youth in the community typically end school around 8th grade. And she told me that before, she knew her community was different. She knew that this wasn't the case in other communities, but she didn't know why. But as she engaged in this social mobilization and with this network of civil society, she learned that it was the fault of the government. And it wasn't that they wanted to give birth at home. It wasn't that they were ignorant. It wasn't that they were too lazy to study. It was that the government hadn't provided them the resources. They didn't have a clinic and they didn't have a school. And so she was understanding that the problems in her community were not just problems, but that the government was responsible for these problems. Further, some members of this mobilization are building new political agency. They're going a step beyond that and saying, not only is the government responsible for these problems, we can appeal to the government to fix these problems, and we might possibly be successful. And they're seeing that through the networking, which I'm going to talk about when I talk about the role of civil society, which I'm talking about next. So, civil society. First off, I'm using a more narrow definition of civil society than often gets used, and that is there's a Khmer term "angka," which means organization, and it got applied to all kinds of NGOs, but also individuals like me, individual activists, individual researchers, and so the term that I use for civil society, I'm trying to encompass the community members' definition of this Khmer term. So I would be Angka in this definition, but the network within the neighborhood or familial relationships wouldn't be civil society in that sense. So this network that I'm seeing, I'm looking at it in 3 different levels. There's a transnational, international, and largely northern. There's a regional and largely southern, and then there's local and Cambodian. And these levels aren't strictly divided, and there's some overlap and there's some back and forth, but it was helpful for me to conceive of it this way. The interventions and roles of the network. Because Cambodia historically has a lack of civil society, and because of the level of development of the country, initially international support for Cambodian civil society has been necessary to build Cambodian civil society, build capacity, and offer this kind of material and technical support. Civil society actors at the regional and local levels have also been responsible for educating these community members on the planned development, why to resist it, and how to resist it. Further, personal linkages within the network of civil society and with specific civil society members have been important. Many community members, when I asked them how they first got involved, they would talk about a specific NGO staff member who talked to them about how important it was, or how to not be brave and not be afraid. And they talk a lot about the personal relationships that got them initially involved in the mobilization, and really, I think, helped them to stay in the mobilization. Networking is happening regionally and locally within Cambodia. Community members have met with other communities facing forced eviction and similar issues around the region and around Cambodia. And that has helped, like I said, build this new political consciousness and new political agency. Because they're seeing what's different about their community, and they're also seeing what's similar. So they're seeing similar and systemic issues around Cambodia, but they're also seeing contrary examples. So community members in Areng met with indigenous groups from Thailand and learned about new models of ecotourism from that kind of networking. And the networking on the Cambodian level is building the new political consciousness that these issues are large and systemic through Cambodia. And networking between the two communities is even happening. And that's interesting because it's connecting issues across the urban and rural in a way that is, for many community members, new. So for example, one Bangkok resident who traveled to Areng made the connection between deforestation in Areng and smuggling at the port in Phnom Penh, because again, it was both corruption and it was both the rich benefiting at the expense of the poor. Finally, diffusion. Ideas, concepts, and even people are diffusing through the network and are being used and taken up by the social mobilization. As I mentioned, concepts which are diffusing from the south seem to be gaining traction in a way that concepts that are diffusing from the north aren't. However, as you can see from this slide, plenty of what's diffusing from the north is being adopted. He's got the Guy Fawkes mask and the UN flag. Interesting to me, the juxtaposition. He has, by the way, I know this guy, he has no idea what the Guy Fawkes mask means. He gets the UN flag, but he doesn't know what the Guy Fawkes mask means. So that's another indication to me that although these concepts are coming, they're not always being adopted completely by community members and members of the social mobilization. All right, wrapping up. Some implications of this. The first implication is that if these are two of the first successful cases of resistance to social mobilization first successful cases of resistance to forced eviction in Cambodia, and civil society appears to have played a key role, particularly Southern civil society, then in order to improve outcomes for communities facing eviction or facing other development-related human rights abuses, focus on strengthening Southern civil society. Focus on Southern civil society and networking at the regional and local levels. And that was something that also Cambodian academics told me, that initially international civil society and international support had been necessary, but now what they needed really was more support for regional and local efforts. Secondly, the second implication is that communities resist eviction because of issues of economics and livelihood. However, these issues of economics are incredibly complex because of the pluriactivity I mentioned, because of the importance of the informal networks, and because compensation packages don't take that complexity into account. There's likely to be continued resistance to forced evictions. And I'm actually going to stop there and say thank you, and do you have any questions? Which is what this says in Khmer. Okay. I survived. And it was 34 minutes, which is pretty good, actually.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
So now we'll turn to questions from the committee, and I'll, per our...
Can I sit and write for this? Is that acceptable?
Yeah.
Okay. Where should I?
Per our tradition, I'll start with John Dale, who our outside member, to ask the first set of questions.
Well, first, Sarah, I want to congratulate you on a fantastic dissertation and your long years of hard work in Cambodia. I've watched this develop over a long period of time and seen this go through various iterations as you've struggled to not only make sense of what was in front of you, but to keep up with the changes on the ground that are constantly occurring and still occurring. So it is a difficult study, and you made it twice as hard by doing a comparative study. So I just want to congratulate you on a terrific job.
Thank you.
And I also have a few questions for you. I'm going to start with your comment about the new political consciousness and a new sense of political agency. And that's a very exciting and bold claim, I think, that can be understood in a variety of ways, so I want to explore it a little bit. You said civil society is playing a key role in supporting this as well. What have the international civil society actors learned from local civil society actors? You made a distinction between those two types, or the villagers and protesters, community members, you called them, about resistance and social mobilization. And related to that, has this new political consciousness and new sense of political agency, combined with the local insights on rights or human rights in the case of some communities, what you referred to in the dissertation, sort of indigenous or southern versions of human rights, altered the development of human rights at institutional levels? Have you seen anything altered as a result of that?
That's really interesting. I think I heard, actually I need to go in order because I heard three questions.
Yeah, I think it's because of it's really two. Let me rephrase it.
All right.
I was trying to.
No.
Yeah. So what, I'll try and do this slowly. What have these international civil society actors learned from the local civil society actors and community members about resistance and social mobilization? And has this new political consciousness and new sense of political agency, combined with the local insights on rights, altered the development of human rights or rights at institutional levels, whether it's at the level of the Cambodian state or internationally, or maybe just even within their own communities?
Yeah. Okay. So to the first part of that, unfortunately, I haven't really seen. It sounds like almost talking about a boomerang, that international civil society has talked to the communities about human rights and some of these concepts. The communities have kind of said, yes and no, but it hasn't come back to those international organizations really changing how they act in any way that I've seen. The one exception I would say to that would be that the UN OHCHR has been really active with the Areng community. And one of their staff members has actually, he just got really interested in it personally, I think. He's spent time in the community, stayed in the community. And I think he has an understanding, especially of the resistance to relocation, that a lot of the international actors don't necessarily have yet. Because yeah, I haven't really seen any change in. It's been interesting because you read the dissertation, and this community has been kind of almost subject to endless human rights trainings. People just keep coming and giving them human rights trainings, and they know human rights at this point. But I haven't seen the organizations shift that and do anything different about that, other than maybe the UNOHCHR, which has really been working with the community a lot. And the second portion of that was, are they doing human rights differently in Cambodia?
Have you seen these become institutionalized? So yeah, I guess if not at the international level or at the level of the Cambodian state.
Yeah, I'm actually, what I have
institutions?
seen is, I think I've seen over the last couple of years, I have seen more self-reliance, not necessarily self-reliance of the communities, but less reliance on the international communities. And I think more than a change in how the international organizations are doing it, I'm seeing the communities and the local organizations being more willing and able to say, we're just kind of going to do this. And so, for example, in Areng, all of these human rights trainings, I'm not sure those have come to anything, but the activist that spent time in Thailand and learned about Thai methods of ecotourism, that has taken off, and the ecotourism project in the community has taken off. But I don't see it happening necessarily around human rights or a new institutional concept of human rights.
Yeah. Okay.
If that answers that.
Yeah. And you said one of the implications of your study was that to improve outcomes, we should strengthen Southern and local civil society. Mm-hmm. So let me tell you how I'm hearing this, and then I will. Then I'm going to ask you to what you mean exactly by strengthen civil society and in what ways. So when I hear that, one thing that comes to mind is Wendy Wong's book, Internal Affairs, mm-hmm. How NGOs Restructure Human Rights. And the basic theory is that in order for human rights organizations, especially international ones like, say, Amnesty International, mm-hmm. For them to gain political salience, either as organizations or the campaigns they're working on, we need to understand how agenda-setting powers work. And she looks at three components of agenda-setting powers. There's the power for the organization to put issues on the table, and there's the power for organizations to veto what's put on the table, and then there's the power to implement these campaigns that they may come up with. And in the models that she says are most successful, the ones we therefore might want to emulate if they're the successful ones, mm-hmm. if we want to improve outcomes, she would say, central office, headquarters, which is usually a northern NGO within this transnational organization, would centralize those first two powers, the powers to put the issues on the table and to veto any issues they might want. But their southern partner organizations would have the power to implement. So you decentralize that power because it's understood that they understand the local cultural context better. They might know not to throw eggs in this case because that would be food waste. They might get the power of doing a tree blessing, to keep people from knocking down the old trees. So that makes sense, and your descriptions here would seem to fit Wendy Wong's model. But a concern I have with that theory is that it suggests that for human rights campaigns to be politically salient in the long run, we shouldn't let the local organizations put the issues of human rights on the table. We don't give them that power, just to implement what the North decides the issues should be. So that looks like power flowing from the North to the South or the West to the rest, right? Which then plays right into Marxist critiques of human rights and what's wrong with them in the first place, and maybe points to some of the resistance you saw in some communities to these northern versions of human rights. So if you don't mean that when you're talking about the significance of strengthening civil society in the southern regions, what do you have in mind?
That's, thank you, yeah. I think I agree with you probably more than it might have sounded like, because how I see this is, yeah, part of the resistance to human rights is basically that they've been handed a human rights agenda and it doesn't fit. And so I don't think strengthening civil society, just strengthening their ability to implement, and not, I think we need to strengthen their agenda setting ability. And when I say strengthen civil society, I think if we, could strengthen the civil society in these communities, if we asked community members in these communities and I have asked them what their goals for development are and made a list and compared it to kind of the international development agenda, there'd be some similarities, but there wouldn't be 100% overlap. And I think that when I'm talking about strengthening southern civil society, that includes the power to set the agenda or veto the agenda, to put something on this list or to take it off the list. Because I think that's where the resistance is, that they've been handed the human rights agenda, and what they want is the land rights and traditional farming way of life agenda.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. And then I guess final question, which is the natural flow, I guess, from this. Does your research elaborate any new insights about the process of social mobilization that challenges or advances the existing literature? Or do you see it as primarily reaffirming our theoretical understandings and models of social mobilization?
This, and I think you guys know, this was kind of a challenge throughout. Where I ended up is that, honestly, I think that I kind of fall fairly in line with a lot of the social mobilization literature, in the sense of how the mobilization began, formed, and how it has been successful. What I think I'm bringing to this is the focus on civil society, and especially the local civil society actors. And that, first off, I think that the focus on the role of agency is adding something to the conversation. That is something that I didn't see in a lot of the literature, other than there is some literature on agency. There's obviously, there's a lot of literature. But in the social movement literature, there isn't as much on agency and the role of agency in keeping people engaged in movements and mobilizations. And so one of the things what I think I have written here is perhaps less innovative in terms of theory, and more in that I've given a description of a social mobilization which has done something different. it's been successful in these two cases, which other movements haven't. And what I'm pointing to of the role of agency and the role of civil society indicates that since this movement was these movements were successful in ways that others in Cambodia weren't, and that agency and civil society play a role, this is my contribution to the theory, is that in two successful or semi-successful cases of social mobilization in Cambodia, civil society and new political agency played an important role in that mobilization. Does that clarify that a bit?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
Sure.
I'll pass the baton to
So I also have 3 questions, but I wanted to just start off again by congratulating you. That was a wonderful presentation. And as you were speaking, I was just thinking about how lucky your students are to have you. Your passion for your work is so evident. So thank you for that.
You. Wow.
I wanted to actually start off, as I was thinking about this on the drive-in today, I was kind of thinking back to, I think, maybe one of the first conversations you and I had about this project before you had your Fulbright, or maybe it was right after you got your Fulbright, and we had a conversation about ethnography. And I think I remember you asking me, can you give me some stuff to read on ethnography? How do I start thinking about it? And so I would love you to kind of reflect, and especially because I'm going to just break the fourth wall for a minute here, because we have the video camera, and so I'm imagining at some future day when another student comes into me and asks that question to me, I'll be able to say, watch the video of Sarah Rose-Jensen's defense. So I'm wondering if you could reflect back and tell me what you think what you're calling an ethnographic and feminist methodological approach. What did that bring to the project? I'm not sure that it's fully developed in the discussion in the thesis. I see something here about like emic versus edic, and I kind of actually really want to push back on that, because I think what you're talking about is a space in which like those boundaries seem to really have collapsed. The kinds of interplay and that you're evoking, and also John was talking about, between globalized social movement tactics and sort of local, the great image of the guy with the mask and the UN flag. So I'm not sure it's about that. You're really trying to get at the inside from the outside, but what is it? So I mean, what did this Fulbright, what did this intensive research experience bring to this project that you wouldn't otherwise have gained by just kind of showing up in each community, doing a series of interviews and focus groups, and then going back to DC? Does that make sense?
That does, absolutely.
Okay.
And what came out of that was depth and honesty, and in particular around, when I say honesty, I mean that, for example, the first couple of times I asked people, would you leave? I got the kind of rhetoric, which was no. We won't leave, we refuse to leave, we will die here, this is our home, especially in Areng where the evictions hadn't taken place. It was this very forceful no. After I'd been going there 6 months, and after we're having, when we're having this conversation for the 4th or 5th time over dinner, it becomes, well, yeah, if everybody left, or if I thought I could get a better job, or, if the government said we had to go, of course we'd go. And things like that the first time I asked a question, I felt like I didn't always get a complete answer or a straight answer or a whole answer. But after I asked the question 6 times, I would get an answer, or I would get told, that's the wrong question. Once and that was interesting with these questions around, again, around development, asking community members, what they needed. And eventually people would just kind of tell me, you're asking the wrong questions. And they would start telling me, this is what we need, or this is what the problem is. And I want to illustrate why I think ethnography is important. And I'm actually glad that you brought up teaching, because I use this example in research methods. While I was in Areng, I was in the community when 2 other researchers came to do a case study, which they eventually wrote a book chapter on. They spent a day and a half in the community. They did a group interview, which included some women, but none of those women spoke in that group interview. They got the voices of adult male heads of household. They didn't get unemployed youth, they didn't get women, they definitely didn't get female heads of household. And I remember sitting, listening to this conversation and hearing the community members tell these people, these researchers, the same things they had initially told me, which was, no, we won't go. Or no, there's no illegal logging in the community. Or no, there's no illegal hunting in the community. And all of these things that, having spent 6 months in this community, I knew weren't really true. And so for me, I never became an insider. I'm not an insider in either of these communities, but the Fulbright and the long-term engagement allowed me to be at least a regular fixture in the communities, and that, I think, offered me access to more of the insider, more of the backstage or private conversations that researchers who spent less time in the communities just didn't get. And especially in Areng, I'm focusing on Areng because Areng is quite remote, and like people will spend a day or two there just because it takes forever to get there. Whereas Bangkok, it's right in the middle of the city center. Everybody can spend time there, and it's a little less extreme.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Cool, thank you.
Yes, I love that we have this on video, and I will definitely point people towards this because I think that's really important. And I'm hoping that you're going to inspire more ASCAR students ultimately to do things like apply for Fulbrights and to be able to actually spend that time, because I think that's a great illustration.
Cool.
That actually leads into the next question I have, which is, I'm wondering if you could pull apart this notion of communities resist eviction or communities resist dispossession, this language of the community or communities, a sort of generalizing language, right? If you could, because I'm actually really curious to what extent people might be contesting this notion of compensation, or to what extent there's a politics within communities about how we're supposed to maneuver this, who receives compensation, is it simply male heads of household? I've seen this before, because as you know, I also work in Southeast Asia, and so the last conversation I remember having with communities about compensation, it was with a group of women saying, our husbands really want to take the compensation, but we know that if they take it, what they're going to spend it on is motorbikes and second wives. So there was a lot of debate, right? You know, with these guys saying yes to compensation, and the women saying like no, because they're going to just we can't actually trust them to spend it wisely over the long term. So I'm wondering if you saw any kind of debate within these so-called communities about like what it meant to resist or what forms resistance could take. I do think that some of that's in the thesis, but I think that there are ways in which that language of the community tends to like sneak back in. Which I understand as well. It's an easy shorthand, but maybe just to push that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, one of the research participants, a conservation staff member who'd spent a lot of time in Areng, he also asked me the same thing. He's like, how can you say community? Is there even a community? And part of the answer is you just hit on the very last little bit is it's a shorthand, and it's hard to find a way to say members of the community engaged in the mobilization resisting the eviction. But in again, there's a bit of a disconnect between the two communities. Bangkok, I got there after the majority of the evictions had taken place. The mobilization was still going on. Evictions were still taking place throughout the time I was there, but the majority of the evictions had already happened. And there were people in Bangkok who accepted the compensation without contestation and left. And a small group of those, about I think it was 10 or 12 people, actually held a press conference at one point saying that we got this compensation, we don't see the problem, essentially. Not exactly thanking the government, but saying this eviction happened, we got compensated, we're fine. We don't know why our neighbors, our former neighbors, are still complaining. And when I talked to other community members, I was unable to interview any of those people. I had one short conversation with one of them, but I was unable to interview the rest of them. But the community members who I talked to, their impression was that those community members who supported it and kind of stated the party line, had been bribed by the government. So among the community members that I interviewed in Bangkok, there was pretty much universal resistance to the evictions. People obviously at that point were talking about compensation, how much compensation they could get. In Areng, I interviewed, I didn't actually keep good track, but I interviewed a lot of people, including in one village. I spoke to members of every single household. And I found there was an almost universal resistance to the dam. Only one person actually told me he supported the dam, and he was an economic migrant from another province to the community. There was some discrepancy between, where it got interesting actually, was community members in Areng who were also government officials and what their version of this was. Because they didn't typically oppose the dam publicly, but they said instead either it's a project of the government, so kind of we have to do it, or I'll follow what the people say, was what one of those guys told me. So yes, talking about the community is problematic, and I should work on that. But also there is a fairly unified view in both these communities that these evictions at least would be bad things. They may not be unified on anything else, but they are at least unified for the most part on that.
Do you think that also happens in the conversion of land from communal land to individual land through that World Bank sponsored titling process?
That's interesting, and actually that gets back to the motorbike question actually, because this isn't a part of the dissertation as much, but in Areng, in addition to the dam project, there was also a land titling project. Many community members wanted individual land title, but the government wanted to give them, Many people in Areng expressed interest in communal land title. Yeah. The government was pushing for individual land title. There I did see a gendered breakdown. Men were a little more expressed more interest in individual land title for the same reasons that you can borrow against individual land title in a way that you can't borrow against private communal land title. And I think that it would be interesting, the titling process was just starting when I left, so I'd be interested to go now and see where's the tension in titling, and also if some families are getting larger plots, getting titles to larger plots, is that creating tensions and problems? Because I suspect it is.
Yeah. And if you do, I would love to hear more about it, because it's such an issue globally, right? What happens through that kind of process, which are just two very different approaches to even thinking about what does it mean to own land or to relate to land and so on, right? And yeah, I think it's a fascinating issue to just keep an eye out later, right? Rather than to assume that all communities or all individuals want formal title in that individual sense. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it's happening all over Southeast Asia. Yeah, I think that's it for me. Yeah,
I thought you said you had 3.
I did, but I think that's it. Yeah. I think you sort of partially answered my other. Well, actually, maybe. Okay. I'm sorry.
All right. That's back.
I'll take it back.
Yes, no, maybe.
Yeah, if someone gives me a chance to talk. So this is just one final question. So I think this links into a lot of what's already been said. You have a very broad, very forceful critique of what you're calling development.
Yeah.
And to what extent do you think that the folks that you were working with also sort of shared your broad strokes critique of development? I've heard you say that their critique is about development for whom? Who's benefiting? They're pointing out some of the structural inequalities, including corruption, that lead to the unequal distribution of development's benefits. But then also your example, like the example of, we don't actually necessarily want to give birth at home, and we do actually want access to schooling. Is it an alternate form of development, and I'm also wondering, and I'm not sure that this is the case in Cambodia, but in Indonesia, again, like where I work, even the word for development links very tightly to the word for modernity and the word for consciousness. And so like the idea of development like as modernity sounds to be kind of different than what you're talking about, right? So is this simply a structural critique of development as usual, or is this an attempt to articulate a different form of development that also maybe gets imbricated like with notions of modernity at the same time, but maybe in politics gets called anti-modern, if that makes sense. I'm wondering if you could just say more about how your very broad critique of, and I wrote down here, dispossession is inherent in practices of development. Are these folks articulating a form of development or ideas of development that are maybe, counter, but not simply anti?
Yeah, and I was actually, when I started thinking about this, I was reading Tanya Murray Lee, and she's talking about people's conceptions of development, and it was the headhunter example that, like, you know what I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about.
You know what I'm talking. You all don't, but. Community members, when they talk about development, tended to focus on development as infrastructure. And so when I'm talking about my critique of development, that I'm focusing on not necessarily infrastructure, but large-scale processes of development that might include dispossession. So for example, they want healthcare. They want schools. They want aspects of modernity. There was one elderly woman in Areng who thought that birth control was the greatest thing ever. She thought it was awesome. Yeah, we all do, many of us. And so they're not rejecting development wholesale, but they are rejecting development that they see as not beneficial. So even in Areng, there's a question of electrification. Community members aren't sure if they want electrification, if it would come along with, for example, losing land to the poles for the power lines. And so they want aspects of development. They're begging for schools and health centers and assistance with farming. But they don't want a hydroelectric dam, and they're not even sure they want electricity. They're on the fence about it. Some people want it, some people are less. Some people are more concerned that the cost of getting electricity would be more than the benefit of being electrified. And so when I hear their critique of development, I hear the critique of development focused primarily around these large-scale infrastructure, large-scale projects which include infrastructure, and less on maternal health.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Yep, you sure?
I'm positive.
Great, thanks. So now I can sort of take off my stage manager hat and congratulate you on a really terrific presentation and great answers and Q&A. And in some ways, second what Leslie said, that I do hope everybody can go to the tape later on and say, you know, there's a real benefit to getting research grants that allow you for this long-term stay, because I think the point you were making, that the stories you hear after a community gets to know you better and to trust you more, or simply because you also just have more time to have these multiple interviews, right, and talk to those members of the community who might be marginalized, that you just simply can't in a day and a half trip, I think is a really, really important one. And it added to the richness of your study, because you did have these really interesting nuances, so congratulations.
Thanks. Yay.
Yay. So I have also a few questions that I wanted to ask you. And one of them, I'm going to sort of reverse the order in which I'm asking them, because some of the points came up already in the questions John and Leslie had asked. And one of them really relates to this notion of community, and that, you know, does the community want X, or does the community resist Y? And you didn't spend too much time talking about this in the presentation, but you do speak about it in the dissertation. And I think this was really striking. in a couple places in your discussion, and I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about this. And this was the intergenerational differences within these communities, right? So there were differences in how women conceptualized this resistance. It seemed in many places that women were much more active than the men. So that's an interesting question to me as well, right? Why do we see these different responses among men and women to and willingness to engage in risky activities? But the other one was the real intergenerational tensions that emerge in a number of these communities, in part around these notions of human rights, right? With the elder men sort of pushing back on the younger people who are bringing these ideas from the outside into the communities and utilizing them in particular ways. So and so that really struck me, and I'm wondering if you can say a little more about those dynamics and what the implications of those dynamics are for the ability of communities, for both cohesion within communities and the ability of members of the community to engage in resistance.
Yeah, definitely. And the female aspects, the women-led aspects of the mobilization were really interesting, particularly in Bangkok, where, again, a lot of residents in Bangkok are, they run small businesses or own small businesses. So many people in Bangkok work in the informal economy in some way. Men, however, are, and this isn't none of this is 100%, but men are more likely to work outside of the home. They work as drivers, or they work as construction workers, other kind of work. Women are more likely to work in Bangkok from home or near their home. So they run shops from their homes. Some women sew piecework for garment factories at home. And this gives them, on the one hand, more reason to want to resist this eviction and keep their homes. Because if a man is working outside of the home, he loses his home, that's okay. His job is his motorbike, a driver. A woman who her job is her home or her business is her home, she loses her home, she loses her business as well. And so in Bangkok, at least, the large number of women business owners, and I don't know if it's an unusual number, but a fairly large number of single female heads of household, they're divorced or widowed, really kind of made that mobilization female in a way, really. And I didn't see as many tensions in intergenerationally in Bangkok, but the mobilization there is adult and middle-aged. There are a handful of young youth activists in Bangkok, but the majority of that mobilization is older folks. And I think that's because they're the people that own the homes. The Areng mobilization has been much more young people, and part of that is, I think, the other reason that these women in Bangkok have been so involved is that owning their own businesses and working from home gives them the flexibility to take part in the mobilization. Where, they can, a lot of these women they'll run their shop in the morning, close the shop for a couple of hours, go to a demonstration or a meeting, come home. And so they have flexibility in a way that someone working a job outside of the home may not have. And on the intergenerational differences, so the mobilization in Bangkok, at least, is middle-aged to older, a lot of them. In Areng, it's been far more young people. And then I think it's actually a bit of the reverse. Older people, adults who farm, are busy with their farms often. And so younger people who don't have their own households have been much more active in the Areng mobilization, I think in part because they don't have households, they aren't yet married, they've got the flexibility to engage in this conflict. But there are tensions, and there are especially tensions when young staff members from Phnom Penh come and kind of tell these people, many of them older people, this is what you should do. And there's not pushback because it's very polite, kind Cambodia, it tends to be a very polite country, and you don't offer much public disagreement. But there is tension around the fact that all of these NGO staff members are people in their 20s and 30s from Phnom Penh, and that their experiences aren't necessarily relevant to Areng community members. But in Areng, young people have been a part of the mobilization in a way that they haven't been a part of the mobilization in Bangkok. That's also partially just Cambodia, is that Cambodia has a huge youth bulge. And so it's probably more unusual that the mobilization in Bangkok is mostly older people than it is that the mobilization in Areng is mostly younger people. Also, this didn't come out explicitly often, but young people in Areng kind of stand to lose the most. It's the folks that don't have their own, like if the community was evicted, 18-year-olds who don't technically have their own farm or own their own land aren't going to get compensation. And so in Areng, young people have maybe more of a reason to resist this because they would lose out maybe the most absolutely. Whereas their parents who own houses and land might get compensation, the younger people probably wouldn't, because the compensation would be based on household and probably go to heads of household. Yeah. Does that answer that?
Yeah.
Long answer.
So the other, and it's sort of a two-pronged, I suppose, question. And it has sort of putting on my hat, sort of, somebody who was trained as in political science. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you, there's this line you have in your dissertation when you're talking about Bangkok, and you're saying this isn't the success in this community was in stark contrast to the previous and concurrent cases of forced eviction in the city where resistance has been extensive but unsuccessful. And one of the things you argue, right, is that one of the things that made these two communities able to successfully, or at least semi-successfully resist, was the presence of civil societies. But you didn't do research in the cases where resistance failed, right? So how do we know that in fact this is the variable that made the difference, right?
And so I didn't do research. I did actually do research a little bit of research in some of those communities. So less for Bangkok, I did research I mentioned the concurrent case, Boraikila. Boraikila was another large-scale eviction, similar kind of situation. And the Boraikila case was, there were a lot of aspects that were different, but the Boraikila case went on much longer without resolution. And from interviews with civils, and this one I do know, there was an NGO, I won't name the organization at this moment, but there was an NGO in Bangkok that was also subject to the evictions. And so that organization was able to start working in that community immediately. Whereas Boraikila was actually, it was a market area, and there were no NGOs working there. And so, the fact that there was literally an NGO in the neighborhood in Bangkok does seem to have made a difference. Community members talk about that NGO as being how they learned about the evictions in many cases. And for the rural case, I traveled to Busra commune in Mandalkiri, which is up in the north. And it's a community facing, it's not a dam, it's an agricultural land grab, and that one is a land grab. A company is trying to take community land. And again, in Areng, he wasn't an NGO staff member at the time, but there was a Western activist staying in the pagoda, and he founded the organization that became quite active in Areng. And the fact that he happened to be there on a cycling trip when people started hearing about the dam was really quite accidental. And so, no, I didn't do extensive research in other communities, but I did do research in enough research in a couple of other communities. And thankfully, this network of civil society is 40 NGOs is a lot in a country the size of Cambodia. So I feel that I have talked to enough staff members that I can say that in these two cases, civil society and early civil society presence did, I think, make a key difference.
Great, thank you. Well, I have lots of other questions, but I'm also mindful that, we're an hour and a half into it, and
The implication, though, that comes out of that, you had one implication about we should strengthen civil society, but if I were seeing this like a state, I might think the implication is we should get rid of NGOs.
Oh, yeah. If you're the Cambodian government, you want to take everything I just said and turn it upside down.
Do you think that's realistic, or do NGOs offer something else to the state that would?
The Cambodian government is in the process of getting rid of NGOs, specifically land and human rights NGOs. In fact, the organization that sponsored my Fulbright, at the end of the Fulbright run, at the time I was ending the Fulbright, their director had sought asylum in Germany. Because he and the organization had been threatened so many times. I'm actually, the number that I give on forced evictions is 800,000. However, I don't trust that number because the organization that was collecting that data, again, they've been subject to government repression. They've lost a lot of their staff members. They're not collecting that data anymore. And so I don't know where that number comes from. Yeah.
So I don't remember reading that about that in your dissertation.
I think
but it seems like that's worth that's worth probably putting out there as part of the context.
Okay.
That's interesting.
Because it's in this 2013 to 2018, there's been a really increase in repression of civil society. Okay. It's a one-party state at this point, unfortunately.
Well, I wanted to make sure that we gave a little bit of time to the audience members to ask questions before Sarah collapses on us after being grilled for this long.
So we are filming and live streaming, so if you have a question, please use the microphone. And if you'd like to ask a question off camera, please hold it to the end, and then we'll cut the stream and you can ask it then.
Better than the alternative.
Thank you. Congratulations, Sarah. This was fabulous.
Thank you.
And I have not read your dissertation, so I apologize if I'm asking a question that you've covered in there. But as I heard in your discussion here about the, sounds like an activist nature of this organization, and your explaining structural violence to the group you're working with, what roles did you play beyond that of a pure researcher? You talked about participatory in the sense of participants in the research being actively engaged. In what way were you actively engaged in their struggles? And how did that affect your research?
This was, I had a really hard time in the write-up figuring out how to interject myself, because the reality is I interjected myself a lot, possibly maybe more than I could have or should have. But again, the long-term engagement, especially some of the organization staff members became really close friends and colleagues. And I tried not to interject unless I was asked, but when people asked questions like, what do you think of this? I would tell them. Or, when people asked, what I would do would try to be, I would say, I heard about in this country this happened and they tried this. And less, I think you should do this, and more, here are other examples I've heard of. Because community members and NGO staff did ask. And part of the interest in giving back was, again, part of the Fulbright. I met pretty regularly with some embassy staff, and I got to know some State Department people as well. And I was able to bring some community concerns to them. And actually, the reason the UN OHCHR became involved in Areng it wasn't just because of me, they were interested in it already, but I met their country director at a demonstration, and she and I talked, and when she realized that I had a lot of access to the community, I actually helped them set up their initial meetings in Areng, which I'm pretty excited about. And also just, I think, a lot of informal conversations with colleagues who were also friends. I had one, I don't remember if this made it into the final version or as a footnote, but actually dated a research participant. Not necessarily a great idea, but
For lots of reasons.
for lots of reasons. Yeah.
That's a different story.
The big reason is if you break up partway through your research, it's annoying. He was an NGO director, so I wasn't. The issues of power were a little different, that he was university educated NGO director. But we were talking about civil disobedience at one point, and I told him the Bayard Rustin quote that MLK made going to jail like getting a PhD. And I meant this for him, educated, had a job, stable life. And a couple of weeks later, I hear him in Kamai say this to a group of university students. And I'm like, whoa, wait, no, that advice was not for them. That advice was for you. Because I would encourage a 33-year-old with a stable job and a university degree to, if you want to go engage in civil disobedience, do it. I wouldn't necessarily have told a group of 18-year-old college students, go engage in civil disobedience. It's like getting a PhD. So I engaged in a lot of different ways. Sometimes I think it went well, and sometimes I worry that nobody got arrested after that protest, so I guess that's good.
So just to go back for a minute to your methodology informed by ethnography. So it's clear to me what the benefits of that were for you. But to kind of link that to the question that the community asked about development, kind of what are the benefits to them? I think I can clearly see that based on the story that you told about the other researchers who were there and were only there for a couple of days, that one clear benefit might be that they were well represented in your research, or better represented than they would have been otherwise. But I'm curious if there are other benefits for them, or if there have been other benefits, or there are other benefits that you see in the future.
I actually, morally and ethically, the lack of benefit to the communities has been a challenge for me, because I took a lot from them. There was a family in Areng that I stayed with, literally, I paid them for my lodging, but I stayed with them a week, a month for close to a year, and they fed me and housed me, and in both communities, people gave me access to their homes, to their lives, to all kinds of things. On the organizational side, I feel a little better about it, that I supported the organizations that I was working with in other ways. I have edited a lot of grant applications at this point, and some grad school applications. And it was also, we determined from the very beginning that the research and the data would go back to the organizations that I worked with. And that's already starting to happen. One of the organizations that I worked with as a research partner, I then subsequently worked for them as a research consultant. And we used some of my dissertation data in some of the reports that I produced for them, and then also used some of that data in the dissertation subsequently. And so on the community side, I don't feel like I gave, that there was much benefit for them in hosting me, but I think I worked at least some to give back to some of my organizational partners, and hopefully they might be able to improve better how they work with these communities. And in that sense, benefit the communities then. Because yeah, that's the problem with research is we literally ask a lot of people, and without being able to kind of give back in a way. Cool, thank you.
All right.
Okay,
Great.
sounds good.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Are there no more questions?
No more questions.